October 27, 1962, a day that would later be called Black Saturday. The world stood on the precipice of nuclear annihilation. Two superpowers locked in a deadly game of chess, where one wrong move could end civilization as we know it. This is the story of how close we came to World War III, a story of miscalculation, courage, and the thin line between survival and destruction. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the day the Cold War almost turned nuclear. To understand how we reached the brink of nuclear war, we need to go back to the ashes of World War II, where two victorious allies became bitter enemies. The United States and the Soviet Union. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus totalitarianism. By 1962, the Cold War had been raging for 17 years. But it was always just that, cold. Proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, but never direct confrontation. Both sides had built massive arsenals of nuclear weapons. The doctrine was simple: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. If one side launched, the other would retaliate, and both nations would be destroyed. It was a terrifying balance that somehow kept the peace. But 90 miles from the Florida coast, a revolutionary named Fidel Castro had just overthrown the Cuban government. Cuba, once a playground for American tourists and businesses, had turned communist, and the United States wasn't happy about it. In April 1961, President Kennedy authorized a CIA-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster. Cuban forces, with Soviet support, crushed the invaders in just 3 days. Kennedy was humiliated, Castro was emboldened, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. If America could place nuclear missiles in Turkey pointing at Moscow, why couldn't the Soviets place missiles in Cuba pointing at Washington? It seemed only fair. But more importantly, it would change the entire balance of power. Throughout the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began making regular trips to Cuba. Officially, they were delivering defensive weapons, but the CIA suspected something more sinister was happening. October 14, 1962. A U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Richard Heiser flew over western Cuba. What his cameras captured would change everything. The photos revealed something terrifying: medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. Missiles that could reach Washington, D.C., New York, and most major American cities in minutes. There would be almost no warning time. President Kennedy was informed on the morning of October 16th. He immediately convened a secret group of advisors called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. They had to decide, what do we do? The options were limited and dangerous. Do nothing and appear weak while Soviet missiles threaten American cities. Launch an airstrike to destroy the missiles, risking Soviet casualties and potentially starting a war. Invade Cuba completely, or establish a naval blockade, which the Soviets might view as an act of war. For 6 days, Kennedy and his advisors debated in secret. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed for military action. The generals wanted to bomb the missile sites immediately. But Kennedy knew that could lead to escalation. If American bombs killed Soviet soldiers, Khrushchev might feel forced to retaliate. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation. He revealed the missiles to the American people and announced a naval quarantine of Cuba. Any Soviet ship carrying offensive weapons would be turned back. The world held its breath. Americans were terrified. Schools held nuclear drills. Families built fallout shelters. Store shelves were emptied of canned goods. Everyone understood nuclear war might be days or even hours away. October 24th. Soviet ships were approaching the quarantine line. American warships waited. The orders were clear. Stop and board any vessel suspected of carrying missiles. Use force if necessary. At the last moment, some Soviet ships stopped dead in the water. Others turned around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously said, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. But the crisis was far from over. The missiles already in Cuba were becoming operational. Every hour that passed, more launch sites reached completion. Kennedy faced immense pressure to act before the missiles were fully armed. What Kennedy didn't know was even more terrifying. Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes were prowling the waters near Cuba, and the submarine commanders had been given authorization to use nuclear weapons if they believed war had begun. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomatic efforts were underway. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters through official and back channels. Both men understood the stakes. But both were also trapped by domestic politics and military pressure. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter. He proposed removing the missiles from Cuba if Kennedy promised not to invade the island. It seemed like a breakthrough. But then came October 27th, Black Saturday, the day everything nearly fell apart. October 27, 1962 started with confusion. A second letter arrived from Khrushchev, this one demanding that America remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for removing Soviet missiles from Cuba. The terms had changed overnight. Kennedy's advisors were divided. Some saw it as a reasonable trade. Others viewed it as Soviet manipulation. The generals pushed harder for military action. Time was running out. Then, at around noon, Major Rudolph Anderson took off in a U-2 spy plane for another reconnaissance flight over Cuba. He was an experienced pilot, a veteran of many dangerous missions. What no one in Washington knew was that Soviet commanders in Cuba were panicking. They believed an American invasion was imminent, and they had been given more authority than anyone realized. At 12:22 p.m., a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down Anderson's plane. Major Rudolph Anderson was killed instantly, becoming the only direct American combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The news reached the White House at 1 p.m. The room fell silent. An American serviceman had been killed by Soviet forces. The generals demanded immediate retaliation. Airstrikes had to begin within hours, they insisted. Kennedy knew that if he ordered an attack, it would likely spiral into full-scale war. But if he did nothing, he would appear weak, and his own military might defy his orders. He was trapped. Meanwhile, in the waters near Cuba, Soviet submarine B-59 was in trouble. American destroyers had been dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. Inside the submarine, it was over 120 degrees. The air was toxic. The crew was near collapse. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed war had already begun. He decided to use the submarine's nuclear torpedo. "We're going to blast them now," he declared. "We will die, but we will sink them all." But there was one problem. Soviet procedure required the agreement of 3 officers to launch a nuclear weapon. The captain and the political officer agreed, but the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. In that hot, dark submarine, as American destroyers circled above, Vasily Arkhipov stood his ground. He convinced the captain to surface instead of launching. That decision may have saved the world.
B-59 surfaced, identified itself, and departed the area. The Americans never knew how close they had come to being hit with a nuclear weapon, a weapon that would have certainly triggered World War III. As Black Saturday drew to a close, Kennedy made a decision. Instead of responding to the second, harder letter from Khrushchev, he would respond only to the first one. He would ignore the demand about Turkey. But privately, Kennedy's brother Robert met with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and delivered a secret message. America would remove the missiles from Turkey, but it had to remain secret. It couldn't look like America had backed down. The next morning, October 28th, Radio Moscow broadcast a message from Khrushchev. The Soviet Union would dismantle the missiles in Cuba. The crisis was over. Around the world, people breathed a sigh of relief. We had stepped back from the brink. But how close had we really come? In the following weeks, the missiles were removed. Both sides claimed victory. Kennedy had forced the Soviets to back down. Khrushchev had secured a promise that America wouldn't invade Cuba. But the truth was more complex. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. We now know there were multiple moments where a single decision by a single person could have ended civilization. Vasily Arkhipov, the submarine officer who refused to launch a nuclear torpedo, died in 1998. For decades, his role remained classified. He saved the world, and almost no one knew. The crisis changed things. Kennedy and Khrushchev established a direct communication hotline. They signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Both leaders understood that they had looked into the abyss. Today, we live with thousands of nuclear weapons still pointed at each other. The danger hasn't disappeared. It's just faded from our daily consciousness. October 27, 1962, Black Saturday, the day the world could have ended. The day we got lucky. Remember it, because the next time we might not be so fortunate. Subscribe for more Cold War history.